think we're ready to start. Oops, there, the microphone is on. It's a good thing I stopped talking. I want to welcome you all here. There's a few seats left out up front that people should take before they get taken. And we're delighted you could all join us today. This is a great topic. Of course, the first thing, let me just, is good news and bad news. Carmelo Mesalagos, who was initially supposed to be the anchor of the panel here today, was unable to come. He had been hospitalized. But let me go quickly to the good news. He's moving toward recovery very quickly, and we very much hope that we can bring him back or bring him to Washington and to begin to tell us about his new book and lots of other things that. The other piece of good news is that we were able to convince Ted Henkin in probably the shortest period of time possible to join us here today. I know most of you probably know Ted already. He's written widely on Cuba. He travels to Cuba often. He's now a professor of sociology at Baruch College in New York. His latest book, well, he wrote a book back in 2014 that's being reissued now with a new chapter precisely on the topic we're going to be discussing today, or close enough at least. And he is also the president of the Association for the Study, former president.
There's a lot of former presidents here. So.
Right. I raised my hand. And in any event, Ted, we appreciate your doing this at short notice, and we're looking forward to very much what you have to say about this. And next to Ted is Camila Pineda Harnica, who is a fresh face at the dialogue, unlike Ted, who has talked at the dialogue before. She has served as a professor at the University of Havana in the Center for the Study of the Cuban Economy, and she is focused a lot on cooperatives in Cuba, their role in the economy, how they're organized, etc. And she has a recent book called Rethinking Chilean Socialism, a proposal for democratic cooperatives, which sounds terribly interesting. I haven't seen a copy yet, Camila, so. I was going to say finally, but hardly finally, we have Jeff De Laurentiis, who I'm sure all of you know the name, played a key role in negotiations between the United States and Cuba during the opening, and was assigned to Cuba as head of the interest section, and then nominated to be the first ambassador, U.S. ambassador to Cuba in more than half a century. The nomination, unfortunately, did not proceed very quickly, and let's say now, as I asked him, he's got a lot of things going. He's working at Harvard and Georgetown, series of other places. And Jeff, we're delighted to have you here with us today. The idea is to focus today largely on Cuba's private sector, to look at it both as an entity in itself, but also its potential contribution to the Cuban economy generally, and where it's now headed. Is it headed up, down, sideways, etc.? And what is it that's driving the economy? The numbers are always a little bit guesswork on Cuba, but Carmelo Mesalagos estimated that some 30% of Cubans now work in the private sector overall. I've seen lower and I've seen higher. I think Richard Feinberg said it was up to 40% of the economy, or 40% of the employment was in the sector. Haven't seen a good estimate, though, of the amount of the economy that is due to the private sector yet. And the private sector has gone through some ups during a period. Everybody was sort of optimistic when the reforms came with Raul Castro, and even more so we're optimistic about the future of the private economy and its role in the Cuban economy with the opening with the United States and the potential for increased commerce. And more recently, there's been a series of restrictions placed on the economy, which makes it look like it's going to be more difficult to make the contribution. In any event, we want to hear about what's going on in the private sector and how does it mesh with the economics and politics of Cuba today. Ed, why don't you start us off?
All right. Well, I'm one of the rare sociologists who stands on the shoulders of economists when I do my work. So I want to recognize a number of economists in the room whose work I've read and learned from, and many of whom are Cuban-American economists and also Cubans on the island who've worked on the economy. The foremost, of course, is Carmelo Mesa Lago himself, who is not only a great economist, but he's a good friend and has been a mentor for me for probably almost 20 years now. Arch Ritter, a Canadian economist, I've had the pleasure to work with. And I wanted to recognize also Ricardo Torres' work, Omar Everleni's work, Pavel Vidal's work, all of which I've read, and I have the pleasure to have friendships with them. Luckily, we also have an economist from Cuba here with us, and I know Camila's work. I was in Paris last semester, and I actually taught a course on the Latin American left, and we read both about her father, and we read her own work on the current situation in the Cuban economy to study the trajectory of the left in Cuba. So I look forward to hearing what she has to say. What I want to do today to kind of get the ball rolling, give us all something to chew on and maybe fight about civilly, is to do two things, essentially. First, as a way of recognizing the fact that I'm trying to do something that's impossible, which is to step in for Carmelo Mesa Lago. It just so happens that a French journal asked me to review the English version of his new book. So I read it this summer, and I'm actually preparing the review right now. So I wanted to highlight a few things about his book that will help us, especially in terms of numbers, but also in terms of him trying to make sense of a very chaotic and moving target, which is the Cuban economy, but not just the Cuban economy, but trying to separate what is the official or the state sector from the private sector. But he helps us by giving us a term that is kind of a negative term, which is the non-state sector. And so it's actually more helpful to talk about the non-state sector than the private sector because, number one, the Cuban government doesn't like to use that word, private sector. Number two, what is not the state sector isn't necessarily private. And actually, Camila done a lot of work on the cooperative sector in Cuba, on its history and on some of the new innovations and on how those are going. And so we can talk about that as well. So let me just highlight a couple things that come out. And this book is short and sweet and has both analysis, but probably the best thing about it is that you get to hear the voices of Cuban entrepreneurs when you read it. So it's not just, let's say, dry economic analysis, but it's also the voices of Cuban entrepreneurs who are trying to make a go of it in a very kind of uncharted terrain in Cuba. So the idea that Carmelo had in this book, and he actually worked together, which is also a trait that Carmelo has that I envy, he works together with people in Cuba on his projects, and he makes sure that his work comes out both in Spanish and in English so that it can be debated in these two sometimes isolated worlds of the Cuban Academy that operates in Spanish, but then the International Academy that's often deaf to other languages. So that's very a big kind of kudo for the book. The non-state sector, according to him, has the potential not just to help the Cuban economy out of its doldrums, but also to transform the official state sector, which still makes up, according to his estimate, 71% of the economy. So they're looking at, in this book, they try to quantify, and that's kind of an economist's nightmare to try to make sense numerically and quantitatively of the Cuban economy, given the different ways or the lack of reporting some of the numbers in Cuba. But he breaks this non-state sector, NSS, down into 4 different groups. And these groups we'll probably come back to a lot. I specialize and wrote a book together with Archibald Ritter on the cuentapropistas, on the self-employed entrepreneurs and their workers, which make up almost 600,000 people today, those who are licensed. So that's one group, the cuentapropistas. But there's also usufruct farmers. These are farmers who don't necessarily own the land, but they have rights to use the land. And those rights in terms have changed. The terms of how that is operational has changed. But that's another group, and they have a chapter in this book. There's also the new non-agricultural cooperatives. And then finally, the real estate market, the new ability for Cubans to buy and sell private dwellings. So that's the kind of focus of the book. And the book looks at what happened before the current period, before 2010, what are some of the trends during that period, and then there's some analysis. I think probably the best thing to do to kind of summarize the book without having to read it or read through it now is to just highlight 2 things. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to read some of the voices, right? Which is probably the most innovative and original part of the book. You get to hear the voices of different Cuban entrepreneurs give their opinion about what's happening, what's not happening, and what should be happening. Okay, so this first quote, it's actually from the inside cover of the book, and later in the book you get more context. This is from a self-employed worker, otherwise known as a cuentapropista, sometimes called an on-your-ownist. I have to thank Enrique Krause for that term. That's how he characterized the cuentapropistas, as on-your-ownists, as in you're on your own. So this is what this person said in reaction to the questionnaire and the interview that they did. What should be happening, this person says, is, quote, to allow free rein to the fertile imagination we Cubans are exhibiting, which should be done unhindered and unrestricted. The government should facilitate that flow, not obstruct it, and control only what must be controlled. Close quote. The second quote here is from someone who is involved in the real estate business, a home seller. And this person says, when asked, what would you like to change or to happen? Quote, I would like that those who govern us think more on how to make citizens' lives simpler and less about how to preserve ideas that have been demonstrated to bring nothing more than destitution. Unquote. And they weren't even talking about politics. All right? Sometimes talking about economics in Cuba is equivalent to talking about politics, right? The other thing I want to highlight about the book is the takeaway. And the most important part of their interviews was, when they got to the end of the interviews, they asked everybody in the 80 interviews that they did, what are the problems and what are the solutions? What would you suggest? And the most common responses to that first issue, 31% of the people interviewed said, we have problems getting inputs, getting raw materials, getting access to those at all, and getting access to those priced at where we can afford them at wholesale prices. 17% just said generally the bureaucracy and the legislation that is, regulating us is overbearing and it is not really designed to help us. It's designed to control us. And 17% also said that they needed more access to technology and telecommunications in the form of internet. In terms of the solutions, the top 2 responses, each at 30%. The first one is general, but it captures the spirit of kind of what they see as needs to be moved forward. in this reform period. More freedom, fewer legislative obstacles. And then also 30% said better access to inputs at lower prices, which is kind of the second half of their complaint about the lack of access to inputs. So that's all I'll say about this book, except also to say that it came out in 2014 in Spanish, 2016 in Spanish, and 2018 in English, with a slight update based on things that had happened in the intervening years. How much more time do I have to start off?
8 minutes.
8 more minutes, okay. 8 total?
Be precise.
8 more? No, be precise, be precise.
Take 9.
There's a lot of economists in the room, so we need to be very precise, right? So now let me shift, and distributed to all of you, I think, electronically, or maybe it's in physical copy or both, is a paper that I just happened to write. I presented the paper 2 months ago at the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy conference in Miami at a panel on the labor market in Cuba. And I have to give kudos to one person here who is Jorge Perez Lopez, because he edited the paper. So if it's brilliant, give him the credit, right? If it's smooth. If there's any problems, you can come and talk to me, right? But anyway, that paper is entitled The Revenge of the Jealous Bureaucrat. The Revenge of the Jealous Bureaucrat. And I stole that really sly and slick, and I think accurate phrase from Richard Feinberg, a colleague of ours over at Brookings, who came out together with a Cuban journalist and did a quick analysis the day after the new rules were announced for Cuba's cuentapropistas. And so I'll come back to that, but that was the title of it. And I think I really agree with that kind of idea that what's going on here is a lot more about political power, turf control, than about encouraging or perfecting the rules for the private sector or the non-state sector or the cuentapropista sector in Cuba. It's about ideology somewhat, but about politics, control, power of the sector, a competition between the state sector and the private sector, than about perfecting the sector. I use that term perfecting because that's one of the favorite terms the Cuban government uses for a lot of its policy or legislation. We're going to perfect the exercise of self-employment, is what they said they were doing over those 11 months that they froze various licenses. So I'll come back to that. So let me start with a little prehistory. And the prehistory, a very recent prehistory, basically between the summer of 2017 and the summer of 2018, there were a series of what I call gathering clouds or ominous signs that kind of threatened the continued development and opportunity for Cuba's entrepreneurial sector. First came some saber rattling and some warnings about some of the behaviors, some of the quote, and to quote Raul Castro, some of the criminal activities that were happening or supposedly happening in this private sector. And Raul warned that this needed to be controlled. Criminal acts have been committed, he said. There are reports of cases where the same person has 2, 3, 4, as many as 5 restaurants. Someone who has traveled abroad more than 30 times. Where did he get the money? How did he do it? That was in June or July of 2017, and he wasn't just talking. August 1st of 2017, the government issued a series, a new law, a very short law, that basically froze in place the issuance of 27 licenses. These were not, coincidentally, the licenses that were probably most dynamic, most lucrative. They were probably also the ones that had probably been most creative in their interpretation of the laws, and therefore were the ones that the government wanted to freeze until they could perfect them or get them under control. There were also ones that probably relied heavily on black market inputs for their goods, given the problems that they had with other inputs. And so they froze those 27. They got rid of 5. Those who had those 5 licenses were allowed to keep operating, but they would not be issued again. Among the ones that were frozen were Paladar, the private restaurants, or private homestay, among many others. There were raids and crackdowns and closures of a number of businesses over the last year. Diaz-Canel had been, who was then not yet, who was the first vice president of Cuba, expected to become president, which he did in April, but he was recorded in a video railing against parts of the private sector, really a kind of a hardline attitude toward it. And there was a lot of suspicion about how or who leaked that video to help him or to hurt him. It was unclear which was the intention. And then in December at the annual National Assembly, or the biannual National Assembly meetings, they basically said, no, this is what we're trying to do. We need to regain control of this. It has gotten out of our control. And then there was also leaked in February or March of 2018 of this year, 166-page draft legislation, which was basically the blueprint for the 127-page legislation that did come out, published in the Gaceta Oficial on July 10th of the summer. So that was kind of the wind-up to it. I think as I wind up and as I end, I want to do two final things. One of the things that's really fascinating is, if you watch Cuba, really fascinating to watch over the last 4 to 5 years, is that there is an explosion of really high-quality, independent digital journalism in Cuba that covers all kinds of different areas, from sports to fashion to economics to politics. And one of the ones that I follow very closely is On Cuba. And On Cuba has its reporters, but it also has people who will write op-eds. And so a Cuban entrepreneur named Oniel Diaz Castellanos, remember that name, Oniel Diaz Castellanos, has written a series of 5 or 6 op-eds in On Cuba where he has kind of been speaking indirectly to the government, trying to say, hey, you guys are trying to change the rules. Listen to people who work in this sector, to cuentapropistas, to entrepreneurs, and listen to what our problems are. If you really want to perfect the sector, you need to know what the problems are from our perspective, so that you don't just perfect it based on your priorities, but you take us into consideration. So Oniel got together with 46 other cuentapropistas and actually delivered a letter to the Minister of Labor and Social Security, which is the entity in Cuba behind the regulations for self-employment. And they didn't make the letter public. They figured if they made it public, the minister would never see them. They probably figured the minister would never see them in any case, but if they made it public, they would be sure that she would never see them. But they issued the letter to her asking for a meeting so they could sound off. They didn't hear anything for about 3 months. And then finally, in late December, her office called them and said, come on in. 2 of you can come in and talk with us. They didn't talk to the minister herself, but they talked to the ministry. And they had a 2-hour-long conversation where they laid out what their kind of complaints, wish list. I wouldn't say that they presented them as demands, but they said, we want to be heard and taken into account. What did they say? They had 6 things that they highlighted in this meeting. We need better access to inputs. You've heard these before, right? Wholesale prices for those inputs. That was number 1. We need to be able to get access to imports as one avenue for getting access to these raw materials. We need a better, more business-friendly tax system. I think every businesses and entrepreneurs in every country could be on board for that, right? Number 4 has to do with the list, the infamous list of things you can do. They said, get rid of the list of things we can do and just tell us what we can't do. That way, a negative list will give birth to our creativity, our innovation, and not just say you're hamstrung by this straitjacket of what you can't do. Number 5, they wanted to have an ongoing formal dialogue between the private sector entrepreneurs and the government officials and the bureaucrats who make the rules. And number 5, and this is probably the most kind of like fundamental or structural issue that they pointed to, was personalidad jurídica. They wanted these freelancers, which is essentially what on-your-ownists or cuentapropistas are, to be able to become recognized businesses with a business personality, a legal personality, so that can then allow them to do a lot of other things that they currently can't do. And so I think I'll end by saying that when the laws came out, Oniel Diaz Castellanos wrote a scathing op-ed on Cuba saying, dude, you didn't hear anything we said. None of those things are part of the new regulation. The new regulations, according to him, and I would agree in my analysis, are about order and control. And so that leads me to my conclusion. My conclusion is this. I was in Paris last semester at the Sorbonne for one semester, and we held a mini Cuba conference with a number of Cubans who spoke. And I probably boneheadedly entitled it or called it Post-Castro Cuba. And the Cubans who support Castro and the Cubans who are against Castro were both like, it's not a post-Castro Cuba, right? The Cubans who support him said, we're going to continue with the legacy, the Fidelista legacy. And the other one's like, there's not enough change to call it a post-Castro Cuba, right? So the major pushback against the liberalization of self-employment and growth of the private sector in Cuba is quite ironic, given that it has come to a head just as Raul Castro, the driving political force behind the opening to micro-enterprise for the last decade, has stepped aside as president. In fact, while it is quite common to hear Cuban entrepreneurs privately complain that Raul Castro's entrepreneurial reforms did not go far enough or fast enough, mucho más prisa que pausa, or mucho más pausa que prisa, right? It's easy to get those two terms mixed up, right? This new counter-reform suggests that at least some of the other powerful members of Cuba's governing elite, including, it seems, Díaz-Canel, fear that Raul's market-oriented reform went too far, too fast. Indeed, while many had expected the pro-market reforms would deepen over the last 6 months with the presidential succession, perhaps a retrenchment is in store instead. It is worth noting that if you go through the legislation, the 127 pages, there's 20-odd regulations and resolutions and decrees in there. The 5 main new laws there were actually signed, sealed, and delivered by Raul Castro in February and March in secret before he left the presidency. So his imprimatur is on those laws before he stepped aside as president. That's really important. This indicates, first, that Raul Castro has been both the architect of an unprecedented opening towards self-employment and a law and order general president who values order and control above all else. And it also reminds us that grand pronouncements about Cuba finally entering any post-Castro era may be quite premature. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Let me just go right to Camila. I was going to ask you a question. I'll wait till the end.
Great.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for having me here. I would like to talk a little about the book also, and I think it's a laudable effort to interview actors of the non-state sector in Cuba, and to do that from outside Cuba is even more important. And I agree that one can really hear the voices of the business owners, users, fruit farmers, cooperative members, and real estate market actors. It also provides valuable information about the functioning of those organizations, the challenges they encounter, and their aspirations. There are 3 things that could have been the book more useful. The first, the size of the samples interviewed and the methods used to select the interviewers make the results not generalizable. So you cannot have an accurate general view of that sector. Like with many studies done on Cuba and by Cubans, we tend to have, including me, a Havana-centric view, which is not Cuba. And so that's something that could have been done better. And finally, a few inaccuracies in some data that should be corrected. Ban small dates and things like that. But one needs to recognize and some policy measures too. But one needs to recognize the efforts that was put into this study with trying to analyze so many and diverse economic actors, and also because it was done from outside Cuba. My main criticism of the book is that it doesn't tackle the effect that the expansion of this non-state sector has or can imply in terms of equality and social cohesion in Cuba. What has been the impact of this sector beyond economic indicators? And I think this is necessary to understand why these measures have been taken as part of the perfeccionamiento. And please don't think that I'm against expanding the private, cooperative, and foreign enterprise sectors in Cuba. It's quite the opposite. But when suggesting policies, I try to take into consideration the inherent values and practices of those actors, and thus the social effectiveness, if that's our word, effectividad, of those organizations that we're promoting. Let me be clear that I agree that the state-dominated economic model that has characterized Cuba since soon after the revolution has not been effective, especially after the fall of the communist bloc, in satisfying the basic needs, nor in facilitating the necessary participation of workers and consumers in the economy. But to be fair, we need to mention its merits, providing access to universal and quality education like Mesa-Lago recognizes, and this is a strength that could make the non-state sector and the private sector in Cuba be more successful than in other Latin American countries. Healthcare, a safety net, and other social services, as well as equality, security, and social cohesion. And doing all this, it has to be mentioned, despite the U.S. embargo, which is a real and major barrier to Cuba and Cubans. Our situation is not as dire as China and Vietnam before the reforms, but the Cuban economy has to grow consistently over the next years if we want to solve the pressing needs of so many Cubans who now fall below the poverty line, and if we want to stop the loss of young people and professionals who emigrate every day. The point I want to make, again, is that there is more than one alternative to make the Cuban economy grow and satisfy the need of its citizens. Private businesses and more market are not going to achieve inclusive and sustainable growth unless they are under social, not bureaucratic, control. Strong, coherent regulations, correct incentives, and spaces for coordination with local communities are imperative. Debates about the development paths for Cuba should be informed by theoretical and practical economic policy debates that have been taking place not only in economic and academic circles, but also in international organizations such as the UN and ILO. Some of these innovative, progressive policies have been implemented even in the U.S. at the country and state level. The post-neoliberal ideas and practical experiences, or these experiences and ideas, raise questions that researchers on Cuba ought to consider. Should Cuba grow at any cost? Would it be sustainable? Should Cuba promote an unfettered private sector? Should Cuba renounce to the idea of building a more fair and egalitarian society where one's income is mostly tied to work and not to capital ownership? I should congratulate Professor Mesa-Lago for choosing the non-state sector concept or term rather than the private sector term when referring to a sector that includes cooperative, which should not be identified as private businesses. Cooperatives should be independent from the state, which doesn't mean that they cannot get into agreements with state institutions. But true cooperatives are not private businesses because they respond to more inclusive, broader social interests. However, some of the measures that Mesa-Lago proposes in regard to cooperative go against universal and widely accepted cooperative principles. I don't have much time now to talk about the evolution and significance of the cooperative sector in Cuba or about the important role that cooperatives could play in a more decentralized and democratic economy in Cuba. I would only raise a few points, and I could answer questions later if we had time. As Mesa-Lago mentioned, cooperatives are seen as more socialized and having more positive social impact than private businesses. That is why they receive better treatment in regard to tax burden, access to inputs, and credit, among other treatment. That is also why they are seen as the best alternative to transfer activities from the state to the non-state sector. In the conceptualization of the new economic model that should guide the current reform process in Cuba, cooperatives are seen as complementary to the state or what you would call the public sector. Despite all this, while almost anyone can apply and receive a license to operate in a private business pretty easily and fast, only less than 500 new cooperatives have been authorized to be created. The opening to the creation of this non-agricultural cooperative has been under a legislation of temporary character with approval procedures excessively centralized. Cooperative legislation in Cuba doesn't include some of the best practice internationally accepted as key for cooperative success. For example, the importance of cooperative education, intercooperation, contribution to local development, representation, specialized promotion and supervision, among other requirements. At this time, the cooperatives already existent, and those group of people who want to create cooperatives in Cuba are waiting for the passing of the first general law of cooperatives that has been announced as many times as one of the first legislations that would be proposed to the National Assembly after the approval of the new constitution is passed, which is now under the debate by the population. One hopes that the general law of cooperatives solves the many deficiencies that current regulations have and allow for the flourishing of cooperatives like is currently happening in the U.S. and in so many countries. Cuba has conditions to be one of the few economies in the world where cooperatives enjoy a significant participation with all its positive impact and spillovers. But we will have to wait and see if this potential is allowed to materialize.
Thank you.
I use this so I can don't go beyond the 8 minutes. I hope I did not.
Thank you, Camila. Jeff.
Thank you. So,
Good start.
Yeah, good start. Is that better? I was just going to say, and maybe that's why the microphone reacted. I'm obviously an ex-diplomat, now trying to be an academic, at least part-time, and I'm a little bit intimidated by the depth of knowledge that I just heard. I'm going to approach this as a practitioner, as if I still were a diplomat watching on the ground what was happening. And I try very hard to look at this process between the constitutional changes and the private sector, non-state sector reforms as a process, not linear, but rather with fits and starts, progress and reversals moving forward. Most of you here know this issue very well, and I'm probably borrowing or even snatching ideas from what you have said or written. The other thing that I think is important is to approach this in a dispassionate way. which often on this issue becomes difficult. In my view, the proposals that we're talking about that are under review both recognize and legitimize a gradual social and economic opening underway since the special period. I think reform will continue, as I characterize it at the top. Real debate within the system is probably on the pace and the specifics. Obviously, among some observers, the reforms are significant. Others say they're a sham. Many others are somewhere in between. I also think it's a catch-up, trying to bring the system to the reality on the ground. And I'll quote Ted here in one article I saw where he said, essentially, they've changed so many things in the last 2 years that a lot of things that are happening are technically unconstitutional. And this is probably right. The other thing that we should be looking at really is the implementation of all these things. I think it's going to be very important to watch, and it may generate more changes down the line. I also think, in general, there are some very interesting developments here that need to be looked at carefully. My sense has been since 2011, the leadership wanted to make the institutions function. They wanted to move away from the individual to the institutional. And so some of the structural changes in the government they're talking about may prove to be rather interesting. The appointed prime minister to supervise the day-to-day operations of the government. Some power is shifted to that job. We'll have to see how much. But the fact that there are more actors at the top may generate a different dynamic. Eliminating provincial assemblies and replacing them with an appointed governor and deputy governor, also kind of interesting. I think it reflects a delegation, devolving decision-making to lower levels. And this has been a challenge in Cuba, and I think it's interesting that they're trying to institutionalize it. Same with doubling the terms of the ward delegates to municipal assemblies. I think interesting things sometimes happen at municipal levels. And then, of course, there are the term and age limits for the president. The other thing, maybe the second basket, is this constitutional reform process. This popular consultations. Again, many criticize it, but the fact of the matter is you have something like 35,000 workplaces and community meetings scheduled to stretch to November. One could argue that Cuba has begun a public debate on various issues that heretofore had not been discussed in public. I mean, these kinds of discussions, I think, are rare or have been. Now, will these consultations rubber stamp changes proposed by the party leadership, or will they incorporate the feedback? I think we'll have to see. And again, sometimes these kinds of gatherings have unintended consequences. I did see a piece, I think it was in the Washington Post, by Andrea Rodriguez, who reported that Cubans have been calling for direct election of the president and other officials in some of these public forum. There's also been reports that there was significant debate within the National Assembly, perhaps for the first time, with scores of legislators weighing in on the Constitution. Again, this is very new. And I'm honestly not suggesting anything more than what I just said. It's just something to watch and see whether there's going to be some significant change or not. In terms of the private sector regulations, again, we need to keep some perspective. Some, I think, are going to be well received. Others, mostly in the form of limitations that you all referred to, will not be. Again, some obstacles, some not. But we are a long way from concessions to the enemy. We heard in the 1990s, or at least I heard in the 1990s when I was posted there. This is all now a recognized part, as part of Cuba's future, along with foreign investment, however managed and restricted. There was even a consultation of sorts with certain members of the private sector about a year ago between officials of the Ministry of Labor and Social Security. There was a dialogue with private sector representatives. Again, I can't recall that happening in the past. That said, the sector clearly still lacks full authorization in the Constitution, access to wholesale markets, which I should add, wholesale markets are now available to the former state-run eateries that are now cooperatives. And obviously, it still lacks permits to export and import. I remember in various meetings when U.S. officials came down to Havana during the Obama administration, Cuban officials were very clear that the accumulating wealth in private hands remained anathema to the system. Indeed, as you probably know, the '76 Constitution prohibited accumulation of private property, and the new draft calls for a ban on the accumulation of private wealth. I am reminded of, I think Ted Picone left, but Ted and Richard Feinberg's book about the paradoxical promise of continuity and change. Others have described it as trying to accomplish several, up to now, inconsistent goals, which is to maintain Communist Party as the sole leading force, directing growth in the economy, minimizing income disparities. Cuban officials continue to say they will create their own model, and clearly all of this, I think, is part of that effort. Now, in terms of the U.S. approach, I think it's worth mentioning something about that, the current approach. I believe I read that the U.S.-Cuba Trade and Economic Council suggested that the administration is considering changes to its Cuba restricted list designed to increase uncertainty about any transaction with a Cuban government-related entity, highlight the role of the Cuban economy in the commercial and economic structure of the country, persuade the Cuban government to enhance the role of the private sector, lessen support for Cuba among individuals of Cuban descent who support engagement, and cause greater uncertainty by indications that the list of restricted entities may be updated monthly. I think this sounds like an accurate description of the current administration's approach, maybe with one exception. And that's persuading the government of Cuba to enhance the role of this private sector because it's having the opposite effect. It was the individual P2P travelers who frequented all of these private businesses that are now not permitted to travel. I could go through a whole list of reactions from Cuban entrepreneurs, business people whose businesses suffered dramatically as a result of all this. During the first 3 months of this year, I think the statistic I saw was that over 95,000 Americans came to Cuba, a 40% drop from the same period last year. Again, who is feeling the pinch the most? It's these small business owners. I mean, this is just a fact. And we hear percentages like 40%, 70% over the last 6 months. There's undoubtedly an impact on the secondary market as well. And so I think folks have to take this into consideration. Since it is the middle of October and the midterm elections are coming up, I'll just say this in closing. It strikes me that if the administration does well in the elections, we're going to see more movement in this direction. I think there'll be greater steps to try and restrict things further. If the other side, if the Democrats win, we're likely to see legislative action to support further engagement and to try and boost the private sector and increase economic action in general. I've heard a rumor, there are thousands of rumors in Washington and Miami that the administration may take some of the steps I just described even before the election. Don't know if that's true or not, but it's something worth keeping everyone's ear to the ground about. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. I'm going to turn very quickly to your question, but I have just one sort of underlying question that I think, that is, how does the non-state sector, we'll call it that, fit into the bigger economy? Just recently I saw some statistics that Cuba is exporting about $3 billion a year and importing $10 billion a year in goods. Now that's a big gap, and you have two big sources of funding that are declining very rapidly. Venezuela is one, and potentially the U.S., whether it's remittances or tourism, etc., is another. Well, the question is the private sector, or is this economy, can it really survive over the time period that this kind of economic reform takes place? In your judgment, just sort of you.
My quick response would be, number one, never underestimate the Cuban regime's ability to survive anything. Right? Because here we are in 2018, and its demise has been predicted and planned for numerous times. Cuba can find a way, or the Cuban regime or the government can find a way to muddle through and preserve its version of the system that's in place. One version or another, whether it's more state socialism or state capitalism, right? The second thing that I would say is that the government has opened the door slightly, and probably more slightly than ever, to the private sector or to the self-employed and non-state sector. And that is, to me, I wouldn't call it a fraud, but I would say that it's significant but woefully insufficient. One of the facts that none of that money of the exports is done by the private sector, because they're banned by law from engaging in that activity. Some people are able to do it around, cutting corners or whatever, and there are specific points in the new legislation that make that more explicitly outlawed. There is expectation that this legal status of personalidad jurídica, or a kind of a legal ability for those to become businesses and treated in a different way, would give them the right to do that. But that isn't expected, if ever, until after the Constitution. And they went ahead and they put the cart of the rules before the horse of the Constitution. So that's up in the air. So I would just say that, finally, it's always important to look at things with economic logic, but also to remember that Cuba doesn't function primarily in response to economic logic, but ideological and political logic trump economic logic.
Camila, did you want to jump in?
What I would say is that Cuba has relied on the export of services and income from tourism, and that's how it can get away from this imbalance in the good commerce, or commerce of good. And what I would say is that what has happened in this reform process is that it hasn't been, I would say, well planned, because the idea is to strengthen the state sector by transferring those activities that don't make sense for the state to manage, right? But it was never the intention to make those state enterprises that are working well, because there are some that are working well, the biotech sector, some in the tourist sector. And what has happened is that because the sequence of policy measures has not been, or the policies that have been in place for the state sector have not been effective in achieving those goals, the expansion of the private sector has debilitated the state enterprises. So I'm hoping that in this correction phase that we're now, what should happen is that better policies towards the state sector are taken, and so that the private sector doesn't become, and the non-state sector doesn't become a threat to the state sector. And also that I would just say that, I don't know if it's the correct time now, but my interpretation of the measures that are being taken to limit the cuentapropistas is that one of the new legislation that should be passed is the law of enterprises, which would include private businesses and other kind of businesses. So my hope is that what they're doing is saying, okay, you're just small businesses. You're not meant to be medium enterprises or even small, depending to which measure you use to decide the size. So what they're doing is, this is my interpretation. Nobody in the government has told me this. But what I'm hoping is that this organization of the self-employment, which is not a self-employment anymore because they can hire workers, and the license that has the biggest participation is that of hired workers. So that the self-employment is actually self-employment, and those activities that want to grow bigger, that need for a bigger investment, more imports and all that, can take place through the new legislation. That's an important point.
The only thing okay. The only thing I would add is I was posted in Cuba in the 1990s, and they seem to have come through that. And so the capacity to absorb these kinds of things is considerable. Secondly, though, we are at a different place. Information technology has advanced significantly, so there's a lot more awareness on the island, and rising expectations have to be managed.
I'm going to try and take 3 questions at a time around the room, and please just give your name and affiliation, or just your name if you don't want to give your affiliation. Frank, you've been eager.
Yeah, it's a delightful conversation here. I hope we can
be eager and brief.
I'll be very brief on the issue of Mr. De Laurentiis, who was surprised about the thousands of meetings they're going to have on the Constitution. I wonder if he went back to the 1976 Constitution and the thousands of meetings that, according to Fidel, took place and everything that happened in that regard. I wonder if you look at that. On the issue of Diaz-Canel, now they're having they're going to have a prime minister. Well, Diaz-Canel is not the chief of the army. That's Raul. He's not the chief of a party. That's Raul. Now he's not going to be the chief of government. That's a prime minister. Well, what is Diaz-Canel as president going to do? Now, on your question, real quick, you did say, which is encouraging, that the government's moving out of areas that have failed. Cuba just announced recently that they bought French sugar. The question is whether the sugar industry is going to be open up to other than the government.
Thank you, Frank. This lady in the back, the red dress. Tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Seaton. Thank you so much for your time. Given the success that the Cuban education system has had, I wonder what role you think that the education system might play in preparing people for the non-state sector, and perhaps a more sensitive issue. I wonder what you might think about the rise of the non-state sector and the impact that might have on racial equality, and how that may be mediated with policy.
One from the left now. Go ahead.
Roger Betancourt, University of Maryland. My question is for Camila. Around 2014, there was a Norwegian political scientist.
Can you speak a little louder?
Around 2014, there was a political scientist from Norway who claimed to talk about your experience in pushing the non-agricultural cooperatives. And he argued that you were very unhappy because they were not being promoted the way you thought they should be promoted. And in that discussion, somebody pointed out that the things you were objecting to, that they were not promoting, were precisely the things that would lead people to a more democratic socialism and to more participation. And that was precisely the reason they were not being pushed. That was 2014. What would you say about that characterization now? Would you agree that that's still a problem? That's one of the reforms you would like to see? Or has that been addressed to your satisfaction? Your remarks indicated that it has not been completely addressed.
Why don't we start with Camila this time around?
Well,
Since you have answers to all these questions.
Well, in regard to your question, what I can say is that there was an opening to foreign investment in sugar production or processing. I know, like 5 years ago, there was a agreement with a Brazilian company to. Okay. I thought you were talking about, was there an opening for investment in the sugar sector, or a foreign investment?
Will the Cuban people be
well, that's a different question about whether Cubans can invest. And I think it's already happening. And not well, it's limited, but it's happening, and that's another question that I don't have all the answers, but what I can say is that there is a debate right now in relation to the Constitution about whether the concentration of property or the concentration of wealth, or what's the difference between concentrating property and wealth. And there are also people pointing at the concentration of income. And I think these are all great challenges that not just Cuba is facing. I think most countries in the world are facing these challenges of what to do and how to address inequalities. And so Cuba, and you could say part of the population, I think, still supports the pride of having a fair society where all these services are provided. And so you need to have a support system for these services to be provided. You need to have the state to have the resources for that. And I think, and I don't know what's going to be decided, but I think there should be an opening, in my opinion. There should be an opening to the development of private businesses, but the private businesses should respond to social interests. And this, I don't think a concentration of wealth is consistent with a society where public services like health and education are providing to everyone equally. And a sense of the sense of social cohesion would also be lost if there is more inequality that there already is today. Because one of the reactions to not just from the government, the party members and other people who are not benefiting from the private sector now are feeling that the development of the private sector has affected them instead of helped them. So we have to take into consideration those voices too. And I can answer the other.
Well, you might want to answer Dr. Betancourt's.
Yeah. Education, of course, could play an important role. Coming from the University of Havana, I think we could do much better to use our strengths to help the non-state sector, especially the private and the cooperative sector, to be more successful. And I'll let you address the race questions. And I'm sorry, should I continue, or do you want to?
Do you want to respond to?
Yeah. Well, I think that any person who believes in the idea of democratic socialism is not satisfied with how the Cuban economical and political system is organized. There are many things to be improved. I think that has to be, on one hand, you need to improve the system, and on the other hand, you need to be aware that you have the risk of losing or how to make the citizens real actors in the system, so that you might have the right institutions in place, but if people feel that they are not worth of participating in those institutions, they're not going to participate. So that's why I pay too much attention to the idea of equality and social cohesion. And I think that it would be a very long list of things that should be done for Cuba to get closer to the idea of democratic socialism. I don't want to bother or bore other people here. We can talk like. Yeah.
Jeff, did you want to jump in?
Just on the having trouble today. Just on the education system, obviously they will play an important role. I would encourage Cuban authorities strongly to reach out to as many prominent business schools around the world as they can. There are certainly folks on the ground who have studied this and so forth, but I think it would certainly be in their interest to do so. There's lots of expertise out there, and they should reach out for it, because obviously the system is designed for a more historical approach to economics. On the racial impact, this is I've forgotten now who asked this. It was the same person asked this question. It's a good question. I don't have a good answer, but it's something to monitor. After all, a lot of the people receiving remittances that have helped with startups are from families who left the country, and most of those are Caucasian and so forth. So it's something to track. That said, I've certainly seen a number of Cubans who are not Caucasian experience success in the non-state sector, and that of course is encouraging as well.
Let me address the issue of education and the racial inequality question, and then I'll try to reflect a little bit on the other ones. They're very good at teaching Karl Marx Economics 101, but not so good at Milton Friedman Economics 101. As a sociologist, I love that they teach Marx, but as an economist, sometimes I think that they should teach both. And I think that the Cuban educational system has done a terrible job at supporting and preparing Cubans to be entrepreneurs. Obviously, they have a lot of catching up to do after having kind of denigrated that as an occupation or a profession or even a member of society. There have been some notes of encouragement, but most of it is about the government tolerating programs to exist versus it having its own program. So the most important program, to my knowledge, is a program called Cuba Emprende, which is run through the Catholic Church and actually funded, if I'm not mistaken, by a lot of Cuban Americans. Cuban American business people who have tried to cross that bridge and give a shot in the arm to the emerging entrepreneurial sector. And this is classes that take place at 2 or 3 locations around the island of Cuba. There was also at least 2 programs that I know of that taught Western economics one at the University of Havana, and one, that was back in the 90s, and Arch Ritter of Carleton University was part of that. It lasted for 4 or 5 years, but didn't continue. And then there was recently actually MBA offered in Cuba to Cuban residents, and I have a couple friends who actually, one of whom is a successful cuentapropista who has an MBA. I think it was granted by the University of Murcia, but it was actually held in Havana, the classes, and the people graduated with those MBAs. But it only lasted a year or two, and it also was some degree sheltered by the Catholic Church. In terms of, so there's a lot to be desired there, but there is some pioneering work being done, and I would say Cuba Emprende is the leader of that right now. Unfortunately, Cuba Emprende, along with a number of these other innovative programs, has occasionally been singled out for criticism by the government, even though it's tolerated and allowed to exist. The non-state sector and in its relationship to racial inequality. I would be remiss if I didn't say that yesterday I went to a presentation in New York at the Bildner Center by two fabulous researchers, Bert Hoffman and Katrine Hansing. This research was funded by a German research institute, and they've done a 2-year surveys and interviews all across the island with over 1,000 respondents to gauge exactly that question of the expansion of the entrepreneurial, private, and non-state sectors and its impact on inequality. But they also factor in the big issue of remittances as one of the ways that people are able to access funds to start businesses, and how remittances, because of the demography of the Cuban American population, skew those. Their statistic was that 78% of remittances go to white Cubans. So that was shocking even to them, who expected to find that. However, Bert in the presentation made a really important point. He said that it's too easy, and the government sometimes falls into this knee-jerk reaction, to blame the private sector or the non-state sector for the growth of inequality. And he says, actually, that's not right. Yes, it's partially true that it's revealing it and maybe fueling it, but you have to also factor in the collapse of the state sector. The extremely low salaries that are paid to people who work in the state, that's what makes the non-state sector look so desirable, and then brings people in for criticism when they are successful in that sector. So you have to look at both sides of the coin. The other thing that he said that I thought was really wise in terms of the analysis was, it's not so much the rollout of the non-state sector that has increased inequality, but it is how the government rolled it out. It could have rolled it out in a way that would build in special incentives or programs or subsidies to target those people in Cuba who have great business ideas, who are well located, but who don't have any capital. The big issue for them and their analysis is that the big division is that who has access to investment capital and who doesn't. And that breaks down along racial lines because they come mostly from remittances. And the government could have anticipated that and said, we're going to open this up, but because we believe in equality, let's make sure that the people who don't have access to these have it. And they've been very slow at setting up credit systems for people who want to get credit, microcredit, et cetera. And let me just end this comment by quoting someone who had this issue about the inequality, which is a big issue in Cuba. It's been there for a while. It's worsening. So it's much more than emergent. But in Havana Times, another independent digital newspaper that I follow coming out of Cuba, this person said, I strongly believe that socialism should fear poverty more than it fears wealth. And so the focus on wealth as the problem versus poverty as the problem are two different ways to apply the same set of values to the emerging inequality.
Hi, Mary Speck. I guess my current hat is with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, HITED. You mentioned retrenchment, and I'm wondering if you could just very briefly analyze the political reasons for this retrenchment at this time? Is it that the private sector grew much more rapidly than they expected, or is this the inevitable balancing that as soon as the private sector becomes a little bit strong, you have to put on some restrictions? What are the political and ideological reasons right now for retrenchment?
Somebody way in the back. Tell us your name.
My name is Yaya Fanusi. I'm with United States of Africa 2017 Project Task Force. And I'm glad you brought in this question of inequality, but in the entrepreneurial sense. We have been working on setting up a way to bring funds to the African Cubans who want to go into private sector. But we're going to have it, the money will be 40% to non-African Cubans and 60% to African Cubans. We're making that future because we are happy the role Cuba play in the decolonization in Africa. I was one of those who liberate Africa physically fighting. I'm still a federalista, but I'm a capitalist now.
Dan.
Hi, Dan Erickson, Blue Star Strategies, great panel. I just wanted to know what the state of play is on the currency system and currency unification. Is that on the new government's agenda? And how would the private sector be impacted?
One last question, and then we'll go back to the panel.
Rob Warren, thank you for an excellent panel. How do you see Diaz-Canel as the man who presumably is going to take the leadership? I realize Raul is still there, but he's old and perhaps not as active. Is he going to make it, and how do you interpret it?
That's the state sector. Go ahead. Start us off this final round.
Sure.
About 8 minutes.
Okay, great. Retrenchment. I think retrenchment is coming from a number of areas, but they both have to do with political and ideological versus economic. I think ideological, I would say, is that Cuba is having to confront head-on a lot of things that it thought it solved or it told itself it solved. Conspicuous consumption, the rise of inequality, especially along racial lines, regional inequalities, regional migration issues, housing issues. These are all, some of which are chronic, some of which have come back with a vengeance in the last 20 to 30 years. And so I think that there's a legitimate issue about that being against the project and the achievements. However, I think that's less important than the political issue, which is power and the fact that state bureaucrats, their power and their access to various forms of income and control as gatekeepers is threatened by the emergence and the success of the private sector. And I would just point out or refer you back to Richard Fleinberg and Claudia Cueto's article from Brookings that they highlight the fact that some of the laws and some of the regulations that will now be applied in each sector to the cuentapropistas will actually be drawn up, or the voices and the ideas of the state sector bureaucrats in those areas will be able to make the laws for their competition or make the rules for their competition, because I think that there is certainly an issue there over where are the tourists going to go when they get off the cruise ship or the tour bus? Are they going to go to that really great paladar, or are we going to send them through this restaurant that, you know, the ministry or the X, Y, or Z, state sector controls? Because all of that is real hard currency. I've actually been hired to go on a tour ship to educate the passengers about the country they're going to visit, Cuba. And one of the things that shocked me was we hired Havana Tour to run the buses when we got off the tour ship so we could tour through the cities that we visited. And those tour guides who spoke excellent English and gave us the tours were probably getting paid, $50 a month at the high end. But every day when we got back onto the bus to get onto the ship, almost everybody would hand each one of them a $5 tip. So they would go home with $150 in their pockets, which dwarfs their state salary just in one day. So who's going to have access to that money is really important, and I think that's the battle that's happening between the state and the non-state sector. I think your idea about the fund is a great one. Whether you're a Fidelista or not, I think it's great that you're reaching out to Cuban entrepreneurs who are struggling, and I think it's important that both you, as an outsider who's trying to help, but also the Cuban government, shift some of its social programs that target the needy more than just making them universal for everyone, because you're helping people who don't need it, and that way you underhelp people who actually do need it. And so that's a major shift that might need to take place. In terms of Diaz-Canel, I'll end by saying that my evaluation of him so far has been he projects an amazingly telegenic, modern image, playing basketball, playing the conga drums, dancing the salsa, but he's repackaging, I would say, exactly the same political and ideological set of controls, undemocratic controls, and unsuccessful economic policies that he inherited from the Castros. So I don't think we can expect much, but he's certainly been very successful so far at the image manipulation, especially in his trip to the UN.
Camila? He took up a lot of the time, unfortunately.
Well, I would say that in addition to political and ideological factors that, of course, are underneath this retrenchment, there are also practical issues like how are these businesses going to be supplied. So one of the most important criticism of the private sector and the justification behind the new measures are that they are acquiring their inputs from the black market and that they are not paying their taxes. So the legislation are to blame too, because there hasn't been they don't have a legal access to wholesale markets and all that, and the tax code is made to undeclare. So like it's made so that people have to underdeclare their income. But so there are these practical issues also that are justifying the changes. Just to mention that. And the currency, the question about the currency. Well, it was said publicly that it was going to happen this year, but like other measures that have been postponed, that have been, like the law of the general law on cooperative was announced to be that in 2015, or that it was going to be passed on 2015, and it's already 2018. So that's all I can tell you. It shouldn't happen in the near future, but that's a very relative term in Cuba.
Thank you, Camilla. Jeff, you're going to...
So just quickly on retrenchment, I think it's the balance, ideology versus practicality, growing the economy, but at the same time wanting to continue to manage it at all stages and so forth. And this is going to be ongoing for them. On the currency system, clearly they want to do it. They just haven't quite figured out how to do it without creating significant economic dislocation for a large segment of the population. I'm not sure we'll see it this year. I think they have more work to do. And then on Diaz-Canel, briefly, I think in the short term, it's all about continuity.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Let's give them all a big hand. This was a terrific session. Thank you very, very much. Ted, Camila, and Jeff, thank you.